Bad, was it? Great worship service. Our text this morning is found in Romans chapter 8, verse 28 through 30. Reads like this. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of his Son, so that we might be the firstborn among many brothers. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. Well, the first part of that text says, we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Christians love to quote that verse to other people who are having problems. We don't like it so well when people quote it to us when we're going through our difficulties. There are many people who feel that life, the human beings, it's just a rat race. We are the playthings of fate. We're the playthings of chance. And if God likes you, then he'll give you good things. But if he doesn't like you, then he's going to zap you in some way, so just get prepared. But I believe there is another view of what happens to us in the human life. We have it in the words of our text, stated a little differently. We are in the hands of an all-wise and all-good God. A God that has deep interest in our lives. A deep interest in the things that happen to us. He arranges and he rules our lives in such a way that when you put all things together, they work out for our final good. And when it is properly understood, this verse gives you a great deal of hope. It is a verse that will take you through some tough times. Moffat, in his translation, corrects what I believe is a mistranslation in the King James Version. He says, we know also that those who love God, those who have been called in terms of his purpose, have his interest and aid in everything. Isn't that good news? God works in all circumstances. He works in all circumstances. And I would have you hear this. The verse teaches us that God cooperates with us. He's in the business of working with us, with cooperating with us. We have a tendency to want to Americanize everything. You know, those old Western movies, no matter how bad it was, cowboy rides off into the West with the girl on the back of the horse with him, and life is good ever after. That's the way we like to Americanize things. But the text does not say that everything that happens to you is good, because they aren't. It doesn't say all things that happen to you are going to have a happy ending, because they don't. For life may not come out all right in every circumstance, but I can tell you this, God is still there cooperating with your life. The writer of this book is helping us to understand that God cooperates with us in all things, even in the things that are hostile to us. God can take our biggest mistake. He can take our most gross sins, and he can combine them and put them together with other things, and in the end, our life can come out good. We can't do that ourselves. God does that. Let me see if I can illustrate that with a cake batter. How many of you here like to eat just raw eggs? Or you like to eat you just take a bowl of flour and you just sit at the table and eat a bowl of flour, nothing else? How many of you here would like to take a cup of sugar and just slowly eat that sugar? That might not be so bad except if you got diabetes. How many of you would like to take a stick of butter and just take it out of the refrigerator, unwrap it, and just start chomping it down? Sounds pretty gross, doesn't it? But when you take all of those ingredients with a cake mix and you put them all together and you put it in a pan and you set the oven at a right temperature and the timer for the right amount of minutes, and it comes out, you have a great tasting cake. And all of us like great tasting cakes. In the same way, God takes all of the bad things that have happened to us, takes our mistakes, takes our sins, takes the good things that happens to us, and He puts them all together because there is a purpose of God in all things that happen to us. As he closes chapter 8, Paul speaks in verse 35 about some of the calamities that happen to people, Christians. He says, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, hardship, persecution, famine, nakedness, danger, or sword?" And if you drop down to verse 37, he says, "No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us." Now, even in the midst of the most devastating set of circumstances you can think of, when you get away from it and you look back on it, you can see that God was there working all the time, and that no circumstance can separate us from the love of God unless you allow it to. You remember the footprints in the sand? The writer said God left him because there was only one set of footprints, and then he goes on to recognize that God hadn't left him. God was carrying him through the difficult times. There is no situation, however desperate, in which a person finds himself in which he cannot find God, and he cannot find God's assistance and God's aid in those times. Now, the verse also says that God cooperates with us in all things. Now, people react differently to this verse. Some people might say, well, can that verse really be true? Can it really be true? Someone else may say, I know it's not true, for I can guarantee you that life's experience is against that. Another person might say, man, I wish to God it were true. I hope it's true. And then there's some people who would say, I know that it's true because I have experienced it in my own life to be true. I choose as a Christian to put my life into the hands of an almighty God instead of in the hands of grim fate and chance. I trust God more with that. So when I'm glad or when I'm sad, when I'm strong or when I'm weak, when I'm successful or when I have failed and beaten down, it is just not a matter of happenstance or a thing that I experience without any meaning or purpose. My life is in the hands of the providence of Almighty God who cooperates with me in all things. I may not understand everything that happens to me. I may not even like things that happen to me. Trust me, there's some things that's happened I haven't liked. But I know there is a God who is interacting in all of the circumstances of my life. Now, God works in all circumstances for good. The text helps us to see that what causes all this to happen is that things work together. The emphasis of that passage is the togetherness of all the things that happen to us. So Paul does not say that all things work together for good by itself, but he says when you put everything together and you mix it all up, it'll work out for good. You take one event before another event, with event, after an event, put them all together, and that's what Paul is talking about here. Not one isolated event would be good. Let me see if I can illustrate that with Genesis chapter 45, the story of Joseph. Joseph has some brothers, and we're going to see this principle at work in Joseph's life. The brothers are exceedingly jealous of Joseph. Father's made him a coat of many colors. He's Jacob's favorite son. And Joseph has had some dreams, and he tells his brothers that my sheaf of wheat stood erect and your sheaves bowed down to me. Now, that's not the way to really influence your siblings for good. It wasn't smart on Joseph's part to do that. They conspire against him on one occasion, and they're going to kill him. And instead of killing him, they sell him down into Egypt, sold him to some Mennonites who were traveling on a trade route. They take him down into Egypt, and they resell him to Potiphar, who was in Pharaoh's court. And while he's in Egypt, he's there against his own will. He didn't choose to be there. He really did not deserve to be there. He didn't deserve what happened to him at all. And then later on, as he rises into the servanthood of Potiphar's household, Potiphar's wife is attracted to him and tries to entice him to have a sexual relationship with her. And he says, I cannot do that against my master nor against God. And one occasion, she approaches him again, and then she screams that he has raped her. He did not do that at all. He was running from her. And he's thrown in prison. There are many adversities that come to his life. We won't go through all of them. I can tell you this. He cannot understand the set of circumstances that he's in. He does not know why it's all happened to him. It would have been easy for him to have turned his back on God, turned his back on his family, says, my family doesn't care about me. God apparently doesn't care about me. So I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. I'll just live in sin. I'll just be free and do it. Had every reason, humanly speaking, to be a bitter person. And then there is a sudden shift of circumstance. And Joseph, after years of being in prison, is called into Pharaoh's court. Pharaoh has had a dream. No one can interpret the dream. One of the persons who had a dream in prison, he had interpreted it for him. He remembers that Joseph interprets dream. He's called into Pharaoh's court. Pharaoh tells him the dream. He interprets the dream. 7 years of prosperity, 7 years of famine. In light of his wisdom in the dreams, he's put second in command. Now, as you look back on his history, hadn't been good. A famine for 7 years drives a little band of Israelites down into Egypt seeking food. They're his brothers. Again, as you look back on history, it's easy for us to see how the evil actions of his brother put him in a very, very bad place. But at the same time, because we're looking back on it, we can see how all of those circumstances was preparing Joseph for what God intended him to do at this period of time. Now, had you been Joseph, had you been one of Joseph's friends, you would have exclaimed, how in the world is this happening to such a good person? Why is all this adversity coming to his life? Where is God? God has given Joseph insight during that time. He's given him a forgiving heart during that time. And Joseph recognizes his brothers. They don't recognize him. After being certain that Jacob, his father, is well and alive, and his brother Benjamin is okay, he reveals himself to them. Look at chapter 45, verse 4 through 8. And then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. I'm sure their mouths dropped open, their eyes got wide, their shoulders drooped. They said, oh, dear God, are we ever in deep trouble? But let's go on. Verse 5. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourself for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God has given him some insights during these periods of years that he's been in waiting. Let's go on. For 2 years now, there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5, there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. God has revealed some things to him. He's not just down there to save the Egyptians. He's down there to save God's people so that there'll be a remnant left through whom the Messiah can come. Verse 8. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all of Egypt. Now, folks, that's quite an insight for a person who has suffered one tragedy after another tragedy after another tragedy for a long period of time. Years later, Joseph's father dies, Jacob dies, and the brothers are in great fear for their lives, because surely Joseph will want to seek revenge on them for the dastardly deed they've done to him. They suppose that the presence of Jacob, the father figure, has kept him from doing all of that to them. But now that Dad has died, our lives are in jeopardy. Chapter 50 of Genesis says this, verse 19 and 21. Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. Now, if you take in isolation some of those individual acts that happened to Joseph, they don't make any sense whatsoever. But you would say, why is all this happening to such an innocent person? But when you put it all together and recognize that God is behind his life, they make sense. J. Wallace Hamilton, who was a Methodist preacher, now deceased, one of his books gives an illustration of a little boy looking at a parade through a knothole in a fence. And all that little boy can see is what's immediately in front of him through the knothole. When I look at that, I can see you. I can't see you, folks. That's all he can see is what's through the knothole. And he cannot see what's gone past. He cannot see what is yet to come. He just sees what's in the knothole. Then Hamilton said, we human beings are like that during our lifetimes. For all we can see is this little moment of time called the present. And it's as if we are looking at life through a knothole in a fence. And God is up on top of the fence. And he sees the present, but he sees what's already passed, but he can see what is yet to come. You know, life is like a book in which there are several chapters written. And we get all excited because one of those chapters upsets us. It's a tragedy chapter in our life. It's not gone well. And we think that life is going to be over because of that one chapter in our book. Let me tell you something. Remember this. God isn't finished writing the book. He's not through writing the chapters of your life. And that one tragic chapter that we thought was so horrible can blend in with the rest of your life. And if you respond correctly to it, it will become a blessing to you instead of a curse. Remember, God's on the fence. He's not looking through a knothole. He knows everything about your life, what's yet to come. And God is cooperating in the tragedies that we experience to put them all together so that some good can come out of it. Now, God causes all things to work together for good. We have enough common sense to realize that everything that happens to us is not good. There's so much in life that happens that's not good. There's disappointed hopes. There is the pain of sickness. There's the sorrow of death. There's the heartache of broken love. There's divorce. There's abortion. There's drugs. There's illicit sex. None of these in themselves are good, not at all. And it's interesting, and at the same time, it's difficult when the Apostle Paul says, all things work together for good. All things. Now, Paul said a few things. I could understand that. If he had said some things, I could understand that. He didn't say it. He said all things work together for good. That leads us to the discovery that even in the suffering of this present time can become a source of blessing. That may be hard for some of us to understand. There is no sentimental attempt on my part here to declare and try to persuade you that evil things are good. They're not. No matter how bitter the circumstance is of your life, we can learn and we can discover from those things blessings. Actually, it's in these times that it seems to be that we understand God's goodness better than at any other times. In the book of Corinthians, Paul gives a list of extraordinary things that happened in his life. He, for instance, suffered hunger and thirst. He suffered sickness, loneliness. He was robbed. He was stoned and left for dead. He was whipped. He was shipwrecked. And yet not once does Paul reproach God or complain about the circumstances of his life. He says that we're to rejoice in all of these things because he knows that they're working out for our good and for his good. Everything that happens to us is not good, but God puts all things together, and he makes it work for our benefit. Now, the text says something that's very, very important that a lot of people miss. God works in all circumstances with those who love him. This verse doesn't work out for everybody. It works out for those who love him. God's promise is to those who love him. To those who love him. The problem is this. It is easier to love God in the good times than it is to love God in the bad times. Much easier. In fact, perhaps this is a good test. Just how much do you love God when things are going against you? Do you let circumstances of your life get the best of you? Are you as committed as a Christian through the difficult times as you are through the good times? Are you terrorized and tempted to throw your faith away simply because you believe that life is not treating you fairly? Do you stop loving God in those times? It's easy for us to stop loving God and trusting God and begin to pity ourselves. Oh, poor me. Why is all this happening to me? Those persons who have the power to transform evil circumstances into good with God's help are those who love God. Now, God's promise is also for those persons who are called according to his purpose. So, love God. These good things will happen to you out of bad stuff. If you love God's purpose in your life, the bad stuff's going to work together for good. Look at verse 29. What's the purpose of God? Verse 29 says, to be conformed to the image of His Son. Now, the only way that God has of conforming us to His image is through trials and troubles. Most of us don't listen until adversity hits us. We will trust God in good times. When things are going well, you got food on the table, you got a good job, you got a nice home to live in, you got a nice car, the children are halfway behaving. Things are going well for you, and you forget to pray. You forget to read your scripture. You forget to go to church. Then adversity hits you. You get very spiritual. You start to pray. You start to call on God. You may start back to church. Let me help you to understand something. It is only those persons who love God, who trust God, who live according to His purpose in their life, that God causes all things to work out for His good. And here's something we got to get a hold of. Everything depends upon how we react to adversity. Some people go through adversity and they come out strong on the other side because they've had a great attitude, they've trusted God, and it's worked for them. Some people have adversity and it takes them down to the pits of hell and sometimes never to return. It all depends on how we react to it. You may be hurting today. No one else may know that you're hurting. You may be aching on the inside. No one else may know that. Today, adversity may be written all over the face of your life. But I urge you with everything that you have within you to take hold of this precious promise in Romans 8:28, that God will be faithful. He will take you through the time. He'll bring you out on the other side. He'll take all of the things that's happened to your life. He'll blend them together for your good, so that you will fulfill His purpose to become like Jesus Christ, His Son. I've seen it work in the lives of other people. I've seen it work in my own life. And it can work in your life. Father, I pray and ask that your blessings will be upon this time right here. Lord, there may be persons in this audience who are hurting today, and they really have had a difficult time pressing through it. I pray that with the story that we've told of Joseph's life and of the cake mix and the life of the Apostle Paul, that you'll give us hope and we'll reach out and touch you and let you help us and heal us and walk with us through it. Help us to become stronger in the name of Christ. Amen. Would you stand?
Page 634. Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you. Beneath His wings of love abide, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day or all